The story of David and Goliath is one of the most famous in the Bible. People love to compare it with modern events. Anytime a weaker party overpowers a bigger one, we call it a David and Goliath story. The moral we think we should get from it is that even the little guys can win, even when the odds are stacked against him. Although that's part of the story, there is more the author wants us to realize. Everyone knows this famous story, but we don't really know it. If we look at the cultural context, we can see there is more to this story, including who the real villain is. This is not simply a story about the little guy using his skills to overcome a giant. This is a story of how God can do the impossible. There are two ways people tend to derive a moral from this story. The first we can call the worldly view. We are meant to see ourselves as David, facing a mighty challenge. But if we are brave and face the challenge head on, we can overcome it with our skills and courage. After all, David had experience fighting lions and bears. He was already trained to take on giants, so to speak. So if we believe in ourselves like David did, we can overcome the giants in our life. The second understanding we can refer to as the modern Christian reading, which says we should not see ourselves as David, because we cannot overcome giants on our own. It is only God who can take down giants. Really, David is an archetype of Jesus, who fights our battles and has defeated our sin for us. We should really see ourselves as the frightened Israelites, and Jesus is the one who went out and fought the battle for us. To be clear, I'm not denying there is truth in this. We can use this story as an analogy for Jesus defeating sin. But I think there is another dimension to this story, in a third way, which blends the two. On this mode, we should see ourselves as David, but we should come away with the lesson of the second understanding, which is that it is God who fights for us. First, a quick note about who Goliath was. The text tells us he was a champion of the Philistines, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. This would make Goliath about 9.5 feet, or almost 3 meters. No human has ever been this tall, which has led some to suggest that Goliath was not entirely human, but perhaps a descendant of the Nephilim. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Greek Septuagint, and Josephus all record Goliath's height at 4 cubits in a span, which would mean he was about 6.5 feet, or around 2 meters. A height which is well within the range of normal humans to grow. The biblical texts also never say that Goliath was something other than human, and there are good reasons to think the Nephilim, spoken of in Genesis 6, were also just humans and not the descendants of fallen angels. So Goliath was most likely just a very large human. But we should also remember the average height of a man in the Iron Age would be around 5.5 feet. David was also still in his teens at this point, so Goliath was probably still more than a foot taller than him. His armor was said to be 120 pounds or 55 kilograms. This would have been heavy armor that only a massively strong man could have worn. So Goliath was not only tall, but strong. His mere appearance would have frightened anyone. Verse 5 also says something interesting. The Hebrew suggests Goliath was wearing scale armor. J.R. Zorn notes the description of his armor is typical of a Levantine chariot warrior of the Iron Age 1. But Peter J. Lightheart says the scale armor is meant to allude back to Genesis, with Goliath being an enemy like the serpent. This is also supported by the fact that David compares him to beasts, suggesting that he was seen more as a wild animal. Once again, there was a serpent in the garden land of Israel. Israel needed not only a Joshua, but a true Adam, a seed of the woman, to crush the serpent's head. David was the new Adam that Israel had been waiting for, the Beastmaster, taking dominion over bears and lions, and now fighting a serpent. The text tells us David went out with a sling. We often assume this was not a weapon of war, but this would be false. Slings were often used in battles and sieges. Assyrian slingers are depicted on the walls of Sennacherib. Assyrian sling balls were also found at Lachish. Judges 20:16 tells us the Benjaminite warriors were very accurate with the sling. The IVP Bible Background Commentary notes, it is estimated that a skilled slinger could hurl the rocks at more than 100 miles per hour. The effective range would probably not exceed 100 yards. David was essentially going out with a standard long-range deadly weapon of the day. Baruch Halpern even suggests David was not the underdog, but had an unfair advantage. He could keep his distance and fire his shots, just like if someone showed up with a gun to a knife fight. But he Randolph Richards and Richard James push back on this understanding. And note the way the author describes how David went out should have caused the readers to think that David didn't stand a chance. There are important details in the text besides the presence of the sling. First, if it would have been easy for a slinger to walk out and take Goliath out, why didn't any of the other Israelites do so? David would also not have been honored as he was, as he would have brought shame to Israel for using an unfair advantage. The Philistines also would not have fled, but would have been enraged by the dishonorable tactic. In truth, the text tells us David was supposed to lose. All the advantage was with Goliath. In fact, he was not even alone on the battlefield. It says his shield-bearer walked before him. Also, David only brought with him a staff and 5 stones. This would not have been enough to deal with Goliath, because all he had to do was wait behind his shield and shield-bearer for David to run out of ammo. Then he could run up and take David out. The only risk was once someone ducked behind their shield, a slinger could run up with a sword and catch them off guard. But David didn't have one. The message we should get is this should be a short battle. David only had one advantage, which was keeping his distance, but Goliath was covered in heavy armor and had a shield bearer to help him block. All David really had was faith that God would fight for him. Next, the text says Goliath moved towards David, and David began to run at Goliath. David Toshio Samura says, the sharp contrast between the slow movements of Goliath and the quick ones of David are emphasized by the narrator's manner of description. Again, the impression we should get is David has just made a huge mistake. He gave up his one advantage, distance. But the text says that David reached into his bag and pulled out 1 stone and slung it at his enemy. If Goliath ran in front of his shield bearer and charged David, then he would have been basically committing suicide. What likely happened was while David was winding up, Goliath had ducked behind his shield. After David fired a shot, he would keep advancing forward. But when Goliath didn't hear the stone clank against the shield, he probably looked up to see if his opponent moved positions or ran away. And when he did, in that split moment, the stone hit its mark, sinking into Goliath's forehead. It was a 1 in a million shot. David's stone left at the right time. Goliath looked over his shield at just the right time. David didn't win merely because he was a good shot. He won because of God's providence. Everybody drew the conclusion David's God fought for him, while Goliath's God did not. David was right to confidently trust in God. We are not supposed to say, David killed Goliath. We are supposed to say, God killed Goliath. Whatever conclusion we take from this story, the most important one is that we are to honor David not for being a great slinger, but for trusting God. He is the kind of person who will make a good king. Thus, Goliath committed blasphemy against God, and as punishment, David went out and stoned him. He died like a serpent in his scale armor, with a head wound. The lesson we ought to get from this is that if God calls us to fight, He will fight for us, and often through providence. There was no way David could have won this on his own. Goliath would have used his shield to buy his time. When David ran out of stones, that would have been the end. But God fought for David and made sure the stone went where it needed to go. And with that, we should think the story is over. But that is far from the truth. Because I left out an important detail. This is not the climax of the story. The final battle takes place after this, with the real villain of the story. Goliath was only a side quest before David could face off against the real enemy, King Saul. Much of this part of the story is missing in the Septuagint version,
so we'll be focusing on the Masoretic version so we can cover all the details in the exchange between David and Saul.
Let's go back to before this event even happened. God has rejected Saul because of his sin, and he sends Samuel to anoint a new king of Israel. This is done in secret, for fear that Saul will use his power to kill Samuel. David is found and anointed in front of his whole family. In the ancient culture, which centered around honor, this would have brought honor to his whole family. But the text is ambiguous, and Samuel never openly states why David was anointed. This was probably done for David's protection. However, later we see evidence Saul probably found out about what had happened. But for now, David is anointed as king with as much secrecy as possible, and providence takes over. David is taken away to the palace and begins to observe how everything functions. He is made Saul's armor-bearer, and therefore likely would have had access to conversations surrounding military activity. But more importantly, David was given the chance to study the man that he knew he would one day replace. After this, we see Saul goes to fight against the Philistines, but David, his armor-bearer, is not present. The text tells us he went back and forth between Saul and his father's sheep at Bethlehem. It is odd that Saul did not bring his armor-bearer with him for the battle. Some suggest this as evidence chapter 17 was originally a different story, telling how Saul was introduced to David. A redactor reworked them to fit together. But this is overcomplicating things. A simpler explanation can be that the line in 1 Samuel 16 just refers to something that happened at a later time, and is merely giving a summary of how Saul honored David. 2 Samuel 18:15 also reminds us a warrior could have more than one armor-bearer, so Saul may have taken others to serve in this task. But it could also be the case that Saul did not worry about bringing his armor-bearer because he did not intend to lead Israel into battle, but was planning to let his men fight on his behalf. Let's remember one of the main purposes of chapter 17 is to contrast Saul, the bad king of Israel, with David, who acts as a king should. David fights for Israel, whereas Saul hides. And we see this when we are introduced to Goliath. He challenges a man of Israel to single combat. The man who should have gone down was Saul, but verse 11 says, "When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." Saul is not trusting God or fulfilling the role that Israel asked for. In 1 Samuel 8:20, we see Israel wanted a king who would fight their battles, but Saul is afraid and refuses to fill this role. The text undoubtedly wants to display Saul's incompetence. The people had sought a king to lead their armies into battle. It was odd, however, for a king to send out a champion rather than going himself. Saul is cowering and may be so incompetent that he even forgot his armor-bearer. But the text then contrasts the cowering Saul with David. C.F. Keel and F. Delitzsch note the reintroduction of David is meant to contrast with verse 11. All of Israel was terrified, but then David showed up, son of Jesse, who had 8 sons. The author gives us this extended description to heighten David and his family's honor. The repetition and reintroduction is also common in ancient literature, as David Toshio Samuru said. Polzin reminds us that repetition is the mother even in discourse-oriented learning. Certainly, repetitious expressions are typical of a narrative, which is fundamentally an oral text. Polzin lists numerous repetitions found throughout the whole account. This seems to be the style of the author, and not a feature of multiple accounts that are stitched together. The text says that for 40 days, Saul and his army cowered before Goliath while he was insulting them. But as soon as David shows up and hears what the Philistine has been saying, he publicly states, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" This is the first time in Samuel the title living God shows up. In a culture that centers around honor, this would have immediately shamed the soldiers. They were cowering before Goliath when the living God was on their side. Andrew E. Steinman says, "For David, Israel's felling in panic from someone who mocked the army of the living God was an unacceptable demonstration of lack of trust in the Lord as Israel's savior and protector. We even see how David's statement shamed them, since it made his brother Eliab angry, and he attempts to shame David back by suggesting that he abandoned his duty to watch over the sheep. What we see in the text is a public honor challenge, and David responds appropriately with a clever move. He pretends what he said was no big deal, and then in turn pretends his brother's insult was also no big deal, by brushing it off and walking away. But then he goes on to keep shaming the army by repeating what he said. David's insult was clearly more effective against his brother than Eliab's insult that the sheep were not being watched, since Eliab was angered, but David remained unfazed. Saul hears how David has been going through the camp and shaming his army. Saul would be expected to punish David for these insults. After all, here was this teenager walking freely through his camp and insulting his men. But before that could occur, David ups the stakes. He says he will go out and kill Goliath. Now we see David as not only challenging the honor of the army, but the honor of Saul directly. Think of how shameful Saul would look if a teenager went out to do the work he was supposed to do. Imagine if you were getting picked on by a bodybuilder and you asked a kid to fight on your behalf. Saul obviously could not let this occur. So he attempts to shame David by reminding him of his place in society. He is a mere youth and not a man of war. David responds by speaking of his own honor and that he has killed wild beasts before, so why can't he take on this wild beast? He then ups the stakes again in the honor challenge by reminding Saul that the living God is on their side, so they clearly have the advantage. At this point, Saul has no retort, but he has a plan. He has David dressed in his armor. We may think this was a selfless act, but Richards and James say, this may be out of concern for David, but it is far more likely Saul wants the Israelites to think it is Saul going out to fight Goliath, as he is supposed to, or Saul wants the army to see that even Saul wouldn't have stood a chance. Saul may be trying to save what little honor he has left. If David wins, Israel may be deceived into thinking it was Saul. If he loses, Saul could point out that no one would have stood a chance. Whether David is aware of this tactic or not, the text doesn't say, but David declines anyway. Francesca R. Murphy says, David will not sally forth as a replica of Saul, but as himself. Robert Polzin suggests that when David declined Saul's armor, Saul probably thought David was declining to go out altogether. After all, why would anyone face Goliath without armor? Saul may have thought he won the honor challenge. David was shamed and would now leave. But what happened next surprised everyone. David took his sling, 5 stones, and walked out and faced Goliath. God delivered his anointed king a victory with a single blow. Now David has fully shamed Saul. He publicly went through the camp shaming his soldiers. Then he stepped into Saul's role as king and won the battle with a single blow, using an interesting weapon. As noted earlier, Benjaminites were known for their skill with the sling, and Saul was a Benjaminite. But here we have David acting as Saul and slaying the giant with a weapon Benjaminites were known for. But Saul has one more tactic to try. This is where many critical scholars will tell us the author stitched together different sources, because Saul does something odd. He says to his general, Abner, whose son is that youth? But Saul should already know who David's father is from chapter 16. So chapter 17 should be understood as a contradictory account of how David was introduced to Saul. This seems like an overcomplicated hypothesis that can be explained in a simpler way. Some have suggested Saul merely forgot whose family David belonged to, which is understandable, given that a king would have numerous subjects he would need to keep track of. And Saul did say if anyone killed Goliath, that his father's house would be free in Israel. But given that this text comes from an honor culture, what is likely going on in Saul's questions are related to this. Let's remember questions were not necessarily asked to gain information. Often they were asked to gain honor. When the Pharisees came and asked Jesus questions, they were trying to challenge his honor, not obtain information. Saul's questions to Abner and David are likely attempts to gain honor. The army watched the shepherd boy go out and do what the king should have done. At this point, Saul's only chance to save his honor would be to claim David as a son, which we see later that he does. If David is Saul's son, then his family would obtain the honor for killing Goliath, and Saul would avoid the shame that would come from a boy of another household doing what he should have done. Thus, Robert Polzin suggests, Saul's questions are meant to obtain David as a son. That Saul's questions about David is expressed not just once, but 3 times in these 4 verses, should at least alert the reader that Saul's questioning is being emphasized here with a vengeance. Saul says to Abner, "Whose son is that youth?" Probably hoping his own general would agree David should be seen as his son. Abner may not understand Saul's intent, but he may also be questioning loyalty after seeing David do what his own king should have done. He responds by merely playing innocent. Saul pushes on, though, in an attempt to salvage his honor. David is brought before him, and the final battle of this honor challenge is about to take place. Would David trust in God or surrender to Saul? Saul asks David, "Whose son are you, young man?" David's only response should be to acknowledge Saul as his father, thereby giving him the honor and allowing him to save face in front of Israel. But we must remember the backstory. David was anointed as the new king of Israel. He knows God means to replace Saul with him. That honor was given to him and his family. But of course, if he submits to Saul, he will be made royalty without God's plan, but also forsake his father and family. Saul is also still in charge and can make David's life a living hell, which we see he does later, even driving him out of Israel. The pragmatic solution is to appease Saul, the man with all the power. This is probably what the army expects him to do as well, Polzin says. Finally, Saul's questions carry with it a threat of coercion for Saul, thereby asking David formally to renounce Jesse's paternity in favor of his own. Saul's question to David, therefore, is a compelling directive for the youth to call him father, just as he later would call David son. But David, although not perfect, is an example of faith for us today. He knows it is God who really has all the power, and the one who will make him king. He trusted in the Lord, and did not remove the honor his family was given through this victory. He boldly replied, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite," denying Saul the chance to claim him as a son. And thus Saul finally loses the honor challenge. David and his family obtain the honor from this event, and Saul has been shamed in front of Israel. Saul does not admit defeat, however. Chapter 18 says, Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. This would show to all of Israel that Saul was claiming David for his own household and the honor that would come with him. Saul was effectively saying he is no longer Jesse's son but his own. Not only that, but Saul makes David's life a living hell. And even through this, David still denies Saul as a father. He continues to trust in God to make him king, even when there's no visible path forward and when his own life is at stake. David trusted in God when all the odds were stacked against him. Goliath should have killed him, but God fought for him, so David could stand before Saul and declare for us his faith in God's plan and not Saul's. David knew God would defeat Saul for him, as he defeated Goliath. He never submitted to Saul's demands, and what won the day was his faith in God. The question this leaves you with is, what giants or corrupt rulers are in your way? Are you willing to be faithful to God through your trials and trust in his plan, even when easier ways are offered? David could have taken the easy way and accepted Saul as his new father. He could have trusted in Saul, but David chose to trust in the promise that God would make him king. Despite his sin, David was a man after God's own heart, because he trusted in God even when it looked bleak. And God is calling you to do the same. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.